The story begins with a gloomy castle through which the main character walked. Suddenly, a huge monster appeared in front of him, but the guy was not afraid. Then the monster began to growl loudly, showing its sharp teeth. But the hero's power was great, and the light from this energy spread to the heavens. The guy looked at the monster with an impartial look. The next second, he activated his energy, and a glowing sign formed on the floor. The energy from him soared upwards, striking in its power. The hero commanded that the ice cover the earth and embrace it. He wished for everything to fall into eternal sleep. A moment later, the spirit of an ice girl, symbolizing permafrost, appeared. She was the embodiment of the hero's energy that he released. Everything around, the stone columns, the ceiling, and the floor, were covered with ice. The monster, feeling the bitter cold, growled in bewilderment. However, the spirit of the ice girl sent him an icy kiss. The most powerful ice energy covered the monster in ice. He froze in one pose while the hero supported the ice that had formed. It was Shin Hyul, the third son of a prestigious house of magicians. Having finished his spell, he looked around. The guy was completely satisfied with what he had done, because he had achieved what he wanted. Shin Hyul was from the most prestigious house of magicians in Korea, but even within it, the boy was called an outstanding talent among geniuses. This was until one conversation with his father came up. The guy always listened to him and promised to achieve a result worthy of the name of their respected house. Father demanded that Hyul graduate first among the top students of the Obelisk Magic Academy and become the greatest archmage in the world. The father always said that his son had a talent that surpassed his brothers and everyone else. He placed great hopes on Hyul, confident that he would be able to reach the pinnacle of the interactive magic world. He needed Hyul to prove himself at the summit of magical arts, and the guy was all for it. He promised his father that he would succeed, because in order to become the greatest magician in the world, he swore to surpass even his father, the greatest magician in this country. 2 years later, Hyul was still studying at the Obelisk Magic Academy, a prestigious educational institution. The teacher announced that today all students will have a practical test. He then added that a certain Baek Sahek could work as usual since he had nothing to worry about. The guy smiled maliciously and said that the last place was still taken by Shin Hyul. This loser doesn't even understand the basics of magic, and it's not even clear how he moves from course to course. Beksahek always made fun of Hyul, saying that he was useless. Shin Hyul believed that modern magicians were a rather rare and valuable asset. Then came the practical test, and Beksahek was the first to take it. He immediately released a fireball at the enemies. Sahek easily met the monster elimination limit and got the credit easily, as always. Modern magic has evolved significantly with the advent of artificial intelligence. All modern mages had implanted chips in themselves that made it easier to use even the most complex spells, but Hyul couldn't master it. He tried to first concentrate the mana in his heart, the source of his magical powers, then form a magic circle. Hyul had to go through 8 steps in sequence, but he didn't have time, because the hologram monsters attacked him. Sahek immediately started to mock again and say that it didn't even look like magic. Hyul smiled and gave his classmate an evil look, because Sahek had long said that the guy was a relic of the past and an outdated magician. There were always voices around Hyul telling him to give up magic. Eventually, the time to eliminate the monsters ran out, and Hyul, to the laughter of his classmates, failed the test. He was angry with himself for yet another failure, clenching his fists, but still, the guy was glad that he had at least slightly improved the conversion speed. That day, Hyul was declared a loser and his father gave up all hope for him. He even sent his son a pill that would destroy the magic circle in his heart. But the boy couldn't give up on his dream. He chose the traditional method of casting spells, which had long been abandoned, to continue his training. But no one used it anymore, so the only way to study was from ancient books, which took up a lot of space. Well, then the guy's attention was drawn to one of the books lying around in his room. Looking at its cover, he couldn't remember if he had bought it. Then he decided to open the book and look at its contents. Although the book was quite worn, it looked valuable. Hyul could not understand what was written in it because the handwriting was illegible. Well, suddenly he read a familiar name, Whitner, which he hadn't heard for a long time. This was the first greatest magician of humanity, the first emperor of the magical empire of Whitner. This hero was the founder of all magic in principle. When Hyul was still a child, he often came across his name in memoirs. Suddenly, a bright light began to come out of the guy's book, which scared him. It was very unexpected. The advice was so bright that I had to cover my eyes. Eventually, Hyul dropped the book, not realizing what it was. Soon the light enveloped the guy's entire body, creating a pleasant and strange sensation. Suddenly, a voice came from the book, saying that the one who has an identical nature will hear it. It was Rabel Whitner himself who bequeathed this book to Hayul. The guy couldn't believe his eyes and the fact that the book was talking. At that time, he didn't yet know that the fact that he was a scumbag was his great advantage. That day, their teacher sent those who failed the test to extra classes. Everyone immediately thought about Hayul, because he was the only one who didn't get along with the artificial intelligence. Hayul, who had no choice but to suffer from his own helplessness, was as if reborn. The next day, the guy still went to the academy. Everything was as before, and after classes, the students went to the cafeteria. Hayul, as usual, sat at the table alone and looked at the food without much appetite. Then a guy came up to him and said that he shouldn't eat alone. Hayul turned around and recognized his friend. The guy sat down next to Hayul and said that his food looked delicious. This good man's name was Ji Suchin, and despite his sloppy appearance, he was quite an experienced sorcerer. Ji Suchan was ranked in the top 10 in the academy and reached the third circle at the age of 18. Suchin had already extended his chopsticks towards Hayul's food, thinking that he didn't want to eat, but this was not the case. Hayul understood that only this guy could he call his friend in this worthless school life. Then Suchin, with his mouth full, told Hayul that if they were bothering him, the guy should just say so and Suchin would deal with them. But Hayul just waved it off and said that he had found some strange book yesterday. In this unusual book, all pages after the third one arrive. This seems to be a book by Rabel Whitner, unless of course this is some kind of joke from the guys, because when Hayul opened it, light and a kind voice poured out of it. Suchin thought that the book was enchanted, but Hayul said that the voice then said that I was the book, an inheritance for someone like Rabel. Suchin smiled and said that it sounded intriguing and asked if he could open the book. Then Hayul calmly added that there was also something written on the last page of this book. After reading it more carefully, the hair on the guy's head stood on end, because it said something like death. It said that Hayul should create a magic circle not in his heart but in his brain. Lucian was indignant, saying that then someone definitely wanted his friend dead and decided to look at the book himself. Soon the school day ended and it became dark outside. All the students went to the Obelisk Academy dormitory. Suchin went into Hayul's room to look at the strange book. Hayul warned that she would not open unless Suchin resembled the owner, Rabel Whitner. Suchin really couldn't open it, assuming that there was some kind of seal on the book. But then he himself thought that it was stupid and suggested to his friend to forget about this nonsense. Then he said goodnight to Hayul and left, slamming the door behind him. Then the guy himself decided to open the book to read it again. He was once again surprised to notice that he opened it very easily and calmly. Suddenly, the runes in the book began to come to life and glow on the page that was previously blank. Suddenly, a familiar voice was heard calling for its successor. The voice said that the boy was trying to use magic by creating a magic circle in his heart. This is a natural way for an ordinary person, but the voice seemed to imply that it was wrong. Suddenly, the book flew into the air and began to glow again, frightening Hayul. The voice said that if Hayul accepted his will and was ready to become his disciple, then the first thing he had to do was something. Destroy the magic circle in your heart and then create a new one in your head. After that, you need to open this book again and see what happens. Hayul tensed up because even for fun, insisting on creating a circle in the brain was too much. Mana, the source of magic, is destructive to the brain because if it gets into the brain, it breaks the psyche. And this is in the best case and in the worst case to irreversible brain death, which for Hayul looked like a demand to leave life on his own. He didn't understand who would fall for this, so he put the book aside. She remained lying on the table, still being someone's joke for the guy. The next day, Hayul went to the academy again and decided to talk to the professor. He looked at the guy in surprise when he asked him to look at the old book. It looked more like an ancient manuscript that appeared out of nowhere. There was a distinct aura of antiquity about this book. The professor looked at the book and asked why the boy needed him to check it. But Hayul asked the professor to just open the book first, since there were rumors among the students. The guy added that he wanted to know if the book was sealed with magic or something else. The professor said that thinking about the rumors about the boy's academic performance was not a good idea. He promised Hayul to look at the book if he promised to study hard. After examining the book, the professor handed it to the boy, saying that there was no magic in it, it was all nonsense, and it would be better for Hayul to concentrate on his studies. The guy thanked the professor but was disappointed, as he had hoped for something. But surprisingly, neither his friend nor the professor could open this book. Then there is a possibility that all this is really real. Looking at the magic book again, Hayul fell into thought. Soon night fell, but the thought still did not leave the guy's head. Hayul sat on a chair in his room, thinking about the book lying on the floor. He looked at the pills his father had given him to destroy the magic circle in his heart. If you swallow this pill, the mana circle of the heart will disappear forever. An image of a father appeared in his head, who angrily told the boy to at least become an outstanding theorist and forget about practice. Either way, Hyrule had no intention of giving up magic. His hands, as luck would have it, were shaking and annoying while the pills were in them. Hyrule understood that he was already on the sidelines of life, so he had nothing to lose, which prompted him to swallow the pills. If he were to die, then die. The pills started working quickly, and Hyrule immediately felt pain. He doubled over, falling to the floor, feeling the mana circle around his heart crumble. This pain was evidence of the end of Hyrule as a magician, and there was no turning back. He had already crossed the taboo and launched mana into his brain so that the previous Hyrule would die, and a new magician would be born. As soon as the mana rushed into the convolutions of the brain, the old pain became dull, as it was eclipsed by a new unbearable pain. It seemed that this was death, which would soon overtake him, plunging the guy into darkness. But then he heard a voice created with mana, which whispered something in Hyle's ear, calling him his receiver. Light, darkness, wind, and earth. All the spirits of mana swirled and whispered to Hyle that they were one with mana. The boy heard these voices and quiet laughter around him. It all merged into a smooth and pleasant singing, as if he had been blessed. And suddenly Hyrule woke up, his eyes wide open, lying on the floor. His heart was beating very hard, but the boy stood up, surprised that he was still alive. Here he noticed an open book lying nearby. He began to leaf through its pages and discovered that symbols had appeared on them. Hyrule suddenly heard more clearly the voice that congratulated him on his first step. This book is special and is called Ader, and from now on a new chapter begins in it. The writing of the legend of Hyrule will begin through this book. The voice added that it would bequeath all its magic to the boy. At first he wanted to address Hyrule as a successor from the future, but then he stopped himself. It would be more correct for him and for this boy to be addressed as a student of Whitner. A few days after this incident, Hyrule came to the academy again. They had another lesson where the teacher meticulously explained the material. Hyrule sat at the last desk and read his magic book, in which something new appeared every day. Most of the information was about magic, and the Idrid itself contained a lot of hidden knowledge. First, Hyrule learned that mana has a will of its own. For most people who have let mana into their brain, it results in a clash of two consciousnesses, which leads to brain damage. But those like Hyrule are different, and their thinking blocks the will of mana, which allows them not to receive damage from it. Since Hyle's brain is not subject to the will of mana, it was resistant to the interactive magic that is embedded in the brain with chips. While Hyle was reading about magic with bated breath, the professor suddenly addressed all the students. He reminded them with an important face about the midterm testing for repeaters. This time, a new rule has been added for this challenge. From that year on, it was decided that whoever fails this test will be punished. And the punishment was cruel: expulsion from the academy. This new rule was created by the House of Magicians, which was led by Hyle's father. Sahek, hearing this, smiled evilly, as he was glad that this defective student would finally be weeded out. The professor, looking at Hale, mockingly said that one of the students was already on the edge. But the boy didn't react to the mockery in any way, but only thought about his father. Evening came, and the sun began to set, causing the sky to become colored by sunset. Kyle walked from the academy, winding through small streets. Suddenly, his attention was drawn to a sign advertising the rental of a simulation training facility in the city. However, he knew that such a rent would cost him too much. This place was charging as much as 200,000 won per hour, but it wasn't that much, so it was a student could afford. So Hyle decided to go inside, where he was greeted by the administrator. Then the guy said that he was taking 1 hour of training, but the administrator was surprised that Hyle came alone. Usually there are several people training, but since this was the case, the administrator gave the guy a key card to room 14. The administrator also wanted to tell the instructions on how to control the holograms, but Hyle already knew everything. Looking after the boy, the administrator recognized Shin Hyul from the House of Magicians, who was from a famous family and was unlucky. But Hyul himself was no longer worried about this as he entered room 14. Soon a voice announced that the simulation was beginning and the wolves needed to be crushed. At one point, a multitude of wolves appeared around the guy. They were a hologram, but they still looked scary. Although they are low-ranking monsters, 10 at once is quite difficult. The average time to eliminate them at the academy is 12 minutes 32 seconds. But now, Hyle has decided to try out new practices from Ader every day. There is no better way to evaluate your results in practice. It's time to use a new mana circle, the Circle of Infinity. The wolves, growling and baring their teeth, pounced on Kayul. But with one blow, he released a huge amount of energy. This seemed simply incredible to Hyel himself, as he could not believe that he had always had such strength. While others use interactive magic with the help of magic circles in the heart, Hyel does it differently. It uses a magic circle in the brain, causing the magic to circulate throughout the body. Thanks to the Circle of Infinity, the power dormant in the guy was released, and he heard the voice of his teacher saying that there was no need to be surprised because the student had a whole path ahead of him. The Infinity Circle is the very basis of the Whitner style of magic. And now Hyel is able to cast spells because he imagined them in his head. And this is only the first circle of the Whitner style, the Call of the Heart, which can be developed to enormous proportions. This opportunity seemed simply incredible to the guy himself. This is how Hyel's first training with his new abilities went. As the guy was leaving, the administrator wished him good luck and told him to come again. And he lazily headed to room 14 to clean up after the client, wanting to get home as soon as possible. The administrator himself was interested in how unsuccessful geniuses train, but once he looked at the results, he was shocked as Shin Haeol completed the test in 6 minutes 37 seconds. This is a record level of international competitions. The administrator did not believe it and thought that the piece of iron was acting up again. But the readings of the device were absolutely true, and Hyel knew it. That day he started a legend. Hyel was able to create an infinity circle, which became a serious test for him. What was described in Adred was different from all the basics that the boy had studied before. The teacher said that the mana in Hyel's heart, legs, and head can be subordinated to one's will. But the guy didn't understand what it all meant because the description was too vague. It seems as if he is missing something, as if his thoughts are running away from him. In the teachings of magic, it is said that there is a certain wall of enlightenment, and that every magician faces his own mana limit. Then it is as if he crashes into an invisible wall, and this fact is relevant in all eras. However, if you overcome it, you can increase your strength many times over. For now, Hyel should have focused on pumping up his mana through the whole body as it says in the book. It took extreme concentration, but it still seemed like a simple task. When Hyel came to his senses, he realized that he had been pumping mana for 10 hours without a break. In theory, he should have been exhausted. But what's strange is that the guy didn't feel tired at all, even in the morning, walking to the academy. Here at the entrance to the building, Hyel met his friend Suchin, who called him. Suchin patted Hyel on the back and asked why he was so tired. But the guy just waved his hand in displeasure. He now had to maintain his mana content every day, but it was not easy. But the desire to adapt to this circle was stronger. At the age of 12, Hyel was able to form his first mana circle, for which he was nicknamed a genius, and his father began to place hopes on the boy. But now he only has one mana circle in his head, so progress becomes difficult. For magical progress, overcoming the wall of enlightenment is essential. My father once told Kayul one thing, when he still had hope for him, that the ideal is nothing more than shackles. The ideal is an illusion created by human arrogance. From this, we can conclude that the ideal is a pure lie. And while the guy was concentrating on the mana in his body, he felt it. Closing his eyes, he felt mana spreading throughout his body. It was everywhere, in my head, in my legs, in my arms, and on my fingertips. His heart seemed to be on fire, and mana moved through his body the way his master wanted. Not perfection, freedom of imagination is the key to making magic happen without any formulas. Interactive magic reduces the speed of casting spells, but at the same time a monotonous pattern is embedded into the spell. At this time, Waiter's method is as unbridled as thought itself. It can fly in a stream, or it can form into a thin line. That's why Hyel could freely change the form of any of his magic. This magic is free from algorithms and formulas like a bird in flight. Even though it's only the first lap, it's incredibly stamina-consuming. But the very possibility of using this incredible magic is incredible. After Hyel overcomes the wall of enlightenment, he will reach the greatest heights. After another charge of mana, Hyel returned to the academy again. Suddenly, a professor entered the classroom and called Shin Hyel over, asking him to leave. The guy was surprised by the news that a guest had come to see him. Leaving the classroom, the professor said that his father had come to visit Kayul. The boy himself was shocked by this news, since his father had never visited him at the academy. There was a knock at the reception door, and Father Kayul invited us in. The professor opened the door and said that he had brought a student. The father, seeing his son, was even slightly surprised looking at him. Kayul appeared before his father and greeted him, adding that they had not seen each other for a long time. The professor bowed as a sign of respect and said that it was time for him to go. When the rest of the room sat down at the table, the father was surprised to notice that Kayul had not refused to attend classes, which means he didn't take the pill he sent him. Kayul confirmed this, but still wanted to tell everything that happened. At first, he paused uncertainly, but then finished saying that he had achieved some magic. The father simply waved it off, saying that his son was simply still chasing empty dreams. Hyul replied that he still intends to become the greatest magician of the generation. Hearing this, the father's eyes began to express complete bewilderment. But Kayul's gaze was calm and confident, as he was confident in his words. Father sighed heavily and said that Kayul had already lost a whole year. It's time to finally accept the reality of what is happening. No matter how hard Hyul works, he can hardly achieve anything in the future. As long as his body is incompatible with interactive magic, the boy will not become a real magician. At least he still has an extraordinary talent. So it's worth giving up meaningless ideals and taking up theory. But the guy didn't agree with this and sharply objected. He added once again that he will never give up magic and his talent. Ordinary life certainly doesn't appeal to Hyul, especially in the shadow of his father. What Shin Hyul really wanted was led the House of Magic. At first, the father remained silent about this, but then said that becoming the head of a family of magicians is not something that can be achieved by desire alone. But Kayul replied that he would prove it to his father in practice. He stared at his son in surprise, not understanding what he was going to prove, because barely moving from one course to another and being on the verge of expulsion was definitely not right. Then Hyul suddenly stood up and said that next week he would definitely be in the top 10, and if he fails, he will leave the academy and devote himself to theory as his father wishes. But if he manages to do this, he wants his father to recognize him as a magician and for him to provide the appropriate support. The father sighed wearily and said that, apparently, Kayul's small successes had completely gone to his head. Then he abruptly stood up from his chair and headed towards the exit. Finally, he told his son that he hoped that this was not all empty talk. Looking after his father, the boy silently thought about fulfilling his promise. So several days passed during which the guy trained. One clear morning, which had once again arrived at the academy, the professor again addressed the students in class. He said that the final format of the exam has been officially approved. The girls at the next desk immediately assumed that there would be team battles, or battles with monsters. The professor said that students will be in for one-on-one fights, or, in other words, a struggle between students. The trials will last 3 days and special guests will be invited at round 16. These will be official representatives of the Magic Tower as observers. It was necessary to give it his all. And this time, Hyul decided to prove to everyone and show what he was capable of. Soon the school day at the academy ended, and the students began to go home. They discussed duels and that they would be visited by the Magic Towers, which definitely meant a game of large. Hyul thought about how the academy was in an uproar over the upcoming midterm exams, and he knew that he would definitely attract the attention of the media. It's all because of the Magic Tower, an international organization created by a dozen of the best of them. Their strength is not inferior to the strength of an entire country, and all the students of the academy strive to join it. Suddenly, the guy's thoughts were interrupted by a familiar, annoying voice calling him defective. It was Bek Sahek, who was looking mockingly at Hyul and his friends. The guy just looked at him with disdain since Bek Sahek always irritated him. But at the same time, he is among the top repeaters, which has enhanced his reputation. Suddenly, he approached Hyul and said that it seemed that in the first duel of the midterm exams, he would be Hyul's opponent. Smiling cheekily, he asked if Kayul was already tasting defeat. Sahek was absolutely sure that he would set a new record for that incident 5 years ago. Indeed, something interesting happened 5 years ago. This was the final of the competition of young talents, where Kayul became the best. Sahek lost to Kayul, who became the winner, and then Sahek was just a loser. Well, as soon as it became clear that Hyul was not compatible with interactive magic, Sahek began to mock him. He pestered Kayul non-stop, threatening to expel him for failing the exam. He threatened to knock out Hyul so that he himself would not witness his failure and then cried into his pillow. Unfortunately, Sahek was Hyul's first opponent, so he couldn't miss the opportunity to spite him by first putting on an indifferent face. The guy was confident that he would definitely show his skills in the midterm exams and use Bek Sahek to the fullest. Suddenly, the conflict between two students attracted everyone's attention because it became loud. Sahek laughed evilly and said that he was definitely not a match for this defective guy. Let Kayul not deceive himself and know his place. Otherwise, it looks like he's just gone off the rails. The guy, having listened to the end of the mockery, simply exhaled calmly. Then he smiled slyly and said that 5 years ago, Sahek had probably also barked at him, but failed miserably. Unfortunately, he hasn't learned anything since then. These words seriously affected Sahek, who even began to tremble with anger. But Hayol laughed and added that Saheka was still upset about that incident, since he turned out to be a loser. These words had already brought Sahek to the extreme stage of anger, from which his face changed. He grabbed Hayul by the collar and called him a fool, intending to strike him. But the guy just grabbed Sahek by the hand and said that, apparently, living in the shadow of those around him was not allowing him to change. There will always be someone stronger who will trample Sahek into the dirt. But geniuses always remain geniuses, and Kayul was determined to imprint this on his opponent's skin, so he told him to get ready. After which he confidently turned around and walked away under Sahek's surprised gaze. This behavior outraged the guy, who called Hayol arrogant and promised to burn him to the ground and trample on the ashes. The next day, the news was already full of headlines about the return of the fallen genius Shin Hayol from the famous House of Magic. Everyone was wondering if he would be rehabilitated or if viewers would witness his final downfall. All these headlines were clearly a plot by the Beck family. They contacted journalists and said nasty things, which is obvious to Beg Sahek. But these midterms will show everyone that genius always gets through. The more attention Hayol gets, the better, so Sahek even did him a favor. Suddenly, the guy's phone rang and his father's name appeared on the screen. Kayul picked up the phone, already knowing what the conversation would be about. Kayul told his father not to pay attention to these stupid articles. But the father was sure that Kayul had brought this on himself, and he was absolutely right. After all, Kayul specifically wanted to attract the attention of the public, which the father was unhappy about, despite the fact that he agreed to his son's conditions. He did it. But that doesn't mean that he believed Kayul, because the fact is that for the House of Magicians this did not matter. And even now, the father did not believe in his son's victory, and these articles only disgrace the House of Magicians. So why is all this necessary at all? But Kayul replied that people had already recorded him as one of those excommunicated from the House of Magic. So the damage to the family from Kayul would hardly bother anyone. But the father replied that this damage may not be significant, but that does not mean that it does not exist. Hayol knows very well that no matter what he does, wherever he goes, the name of the House of Magic follows him. Kyle replied that he was aware of this, but that these were all empty worries compared to the benefits. But the father did not understand what benefit there could be from this. What good would his victory do the House of Magic? But Hayol clearly answered that it was he himself, the greatest mage in the world that hails from a House of Magic and the greatest head of a family in history. Hayol was going to become the greatest even within their family. Father said wearily that Hayol's ambitions were just like those of the Tower Lord. But in the end, he resigned himself and decided that come what may, would be, for which Kayul was grateful to him. But then the father added that if Kayul continued to defame them, then he should be prepared for the consequences. These were his last words, after which the call ended. There was silence in the room as Hayol considered his father's words. But finally he looked up confidently and, clutching the towel, said the bets were off. Soon the day of midterm exams arrived, taking place in a huge arena. The stands were filled with inspectors from the Great Tower, watching the students closely. Hayol stood in his tracksuit, flexing his wrists, when Sahek stared at him. He smiled mockingly again and asked how the guy liked the articles about the popularity of the so-called genius. From the first day, the popularity of the articles skyrocketed, and Hayol can't even cast spells properly but continues to disgrace himself. It was funny, but Hayol also chuckled and said that only Sahek would be disgraced here. But Hayol still thanked Sahek, as he obediently crawled into his trap. After all, the guy knew that Sahek didn't like him, so this was the least he could do for him. Hayol suggested quickly beating up Sahek, but only so that he wouldn't whine later, but this only made Sahek angry. He thought that Kayul had definitely hit his head, but he simply lifted the guy up, saying that it was only the first lap. He only needs spells and the first circle to defeat an opponent like Sahek. The arena froze in anticipation after such a harsh statement. On the domestic stage stood two rivals who had competed since childhood. The audience began to look at each other anxiously, waiting for the continuation. At this moment, Sahek's teeth clenched as if he wanted to crush them. Anger consumed the guy completely, and he angrily muttered, "How dare such a feeble creature open its mouth like that?" But then, the referee's whistle blew, signaling the start of the competition. Thus began the first round of the qualifying exam for repeaters. Shin Hayol was confident in his abilities as he stood before his opponent with a clear gaze. Then Sahek gathered mana in his hand and aimed at his opponent. He gathered all his anger at that moment, but suddenly he saw a ball of energy flying at him. The guy quickly concentrated and set up a barrier. Thus, the energy bounced back and headed back at the enemy, but Hyel easily dodged it. He immediately recognized Sahek's signature, an explosion, but he was not going to stop. While rebooting himself, he decided to use the third circle spell. He gathered energy in his hands to create a large explosion, but Hyel seemed to be waiting for just that, staring at Sahek. He directed all his energy at Hyel, creating a huge, loud explosion. The audience was shocked, and the media took out their cameras to capture the moment. Sahek laughed wickedly, saying that Kayul shouldn't have pretended to be all-powerful. But then the guy's eyes filled with surprise when he saw Kayul in the smoke. Moreover, he was completely unharmed and even smiling. This made Sahek even more angry, who used even more mana and fired it at his opponent. It was a blow 3 times stronger than the previous one. But Hyel used his new elemental power, the power of water. With one movement of his hand, Kayul put up a water shield in front of him, extinguishing the enemy's shells. Sahek was shocked because his favorite spell didn't work. He couldn't believe that this loser Hyel blocked his blows so easily. This was beyond the understanding of Sahek, who used third circle magic. However, Hyul was able to repel his attacks with just the first circle magic in a matter of seconds. One of the examiners approached her boss and said that she now understood why he wanted to be at this exam. However, the man himself knew nothing about Hyel's outstanding magic. He just saw an article about this guy called The Return of a Genius and he got interested. The woman frowned with displeasure, not believing that this was just a coincidence. After all, she understood that if the world found out that the ruler of the Blue Magic Tower, if you come to watch student fights, it will cause a lot of gossip. But he, being an 8th circle magician named Kim Cannon, laughed, answering that he himself knew this very well. That's why he asked for a special hidden VIP room so that he wouldn't be seen. The glass in this room was tinted, so even if you wanted to, it was impossible to see who was present in it. Suddenly, Cannon felt that someone appeared behind him. Turning around, he smiled contentedly at the unexpected guest. At this time, the battle in the arena continued and was clearly not going in Sahek's favor. Kayul easily parried his most difficult blows as if he didn't even notice them. Sahek, I was almost out of breath and didn't understand what the hell was going on here. How could his third circle magic be blocked so easily with only first circle magic? The guy also noticed the speed of Hyel's incarnation, which was abnormally high. But Hyel only smiled and mocked, understanding why Sahek was perplexed by his speed. But the guy just waved it off, full of hatred, ordering Kayul to shut up. He had one last move left that would surely crush the enemy. Taking a stance, Sahek sent 3 more fireballs at his opponent. They created a huge explosion that enveloped almost the entire arena. Sahek was fully confident that he had defeated his pathetic opponent. However, before he could finish his furious speech, he saw Kayul's silhouette in the smoke, which was completely intact. Moreover, the guy did not wait any longer and directed his magic at the surprised Sahek. She was so strong that the guy couldn't stand it, feeling all her power. Sahek didn't understand when Hyel managed to create the wind spear so quickly, but Hyel himself only shook off the ashes and dust because Sahek's attack didn't even scratch him. The guy's rage almost reached its limit when he blurted out, "Why does Hyel only fight with first circle magic?" But Hyel replied that it was easiest for him this way, activating the energy again. After that, he again directed the wind spear at his opponent. Sahek put his shield out in front of him, but the magic was too strong. However, the guy was still able to cope with her and even smiled because of it. Sahek understood that it was his turn to attack and his opponent was not so scary. He angrily said that Kayul had become bolder only because he had learned to cast spells a little faster. But this does not change the fact that it is defective and incapable of anything. However, Hyel's magic hit Sahek, leaving a small cut on his arm. The guy didn't understand how the spear managed to move behind him. Then he saw Hyel controlling it with his hands, which seemed unreal. These skills also surprised the guests from the Great Tower, who were watching the battle closely. Confident Hyel suddenly said that Sahek still didn't seem to understand what was going on. So the guy smiled and decided to show his opponent another new trick. Hyel waved his hand, activating a massive amount of wind energy. He then directed this energy with all his might towards his opponent. Sahek couldn't believe his eyes as the boy released 3 wind spears. By default, they couldn't split into 2, but Hyel somehow managed to do it. He advised Sahek to block them well, since there were already 4 copies. It seemed like increasing their number would be elementary, but no one had done it before. With great speed like swallows, the spears flew towards Sahek. He immediately put up a strong and large barrier in front of him. The spears flew straight at him, hitting the barrier one after another. Sahek was pleased, as blocking the first circle spells was not difficult for him. Well, suddenly one of the copies somehow appeared behind his back. This was very strange since usually this weapon does not change trajectory. Kayul replied that it was okay to think about details, but you couldn't get distracted in the middle of a fight. Moreover, he has only just begun to use his power. The huge wind spears shot up again. All Sahek could do was curse and move out of range of the spears to keep his distance. For some reason, the guy was sure that Hyle's radius of destruction was limited. You just have to keep your distance, and then these unpredictable attacks won't get to him. Kyle smiled, praising his opponent for a good conclusion. Then he crossed his hands together and pointed them straight at Sahek. A huge stream of wind magic poured out of them. Sahek couldn't believe his eyes, as Hyle's magic was able to reach him from a great distance. Now Sahek was completely taken aback and screamed. Kim Kanun, watching the battle, was surprised that Hyle could activate magic so quickly. Moreover, this guy could connect spells and change their flight paths, which was incredible. The world has definitely never seen such magic. Another spectator was watching all this, Mr. Shin In-hyuk, Hyle's father. He was the head of a respected line of magicians and a wizard of the 8th circle. The girl standing next to me said that Hyle's magic simply ignores all the rules of the spell source code. The original spell code for the reverse cutter, for example, had a maximum radius of 37.44 meters and a speed of 116 kilometers per hour. The trajectory can be changed once, and if the target is more than 38 meters away from the wizard, the magic will never reach the target. The trajectory cannot be reassigned just like that. In other words, everything works according to the source code. Because of this, battles between modern wizards are more of a battle of wits. When a thoroughly studied spell is used, all that remains is to anticipate the opponent's actions. The ability to react immediately is a key factor, just like in computer games. However, Whitner's magical style ignores all principles of the spell's source code. Thus, even at a greater distance, Hyle's energy was able to reach the enemy. After a hard blow, Bek Sahek fell to the ground, thinking with annoyance that he was losing to the magic of the first circle. Approaching him, Hyle said that one should not underestimate the magic of the first circle. In this case, the third circle of Sahek's magic does not matter, since even the most ordinary pen can destroy a person. When Hyle created a clot of energy in his hand, the surprised and frightened Sahek could not understand what it was. But Kayul, smiling, replied that this was only the magic of the first circle. In this case, it was water magic, so it didn't require any incredible spells to destroy it. Hyle aimed a bubble of water straight at Sahek's face, causing him to suffocate without oxygen. Hyul added that the Academy's combat uniform was enchanted with a magical barrier called the Safety Zone. But now it is absolutely useless for this magic, just like Sahek himself, completely immobilized and helpless. Eventually, Sahek fell to the arena floor and stopped moving. Kayul also did not say a word, as did all the spectators sitting in the stands. Suddenly, the guy looked at his helpless opponent and told the instructor that the result was obvious, after which he whistled sharply, as if coming to his senses, ending the duel. Thus, it was announced to the entire arena that the winner was unexpectedly Shin Hale. Sahek, who was barely able to stand on his feet, was taken away from the battlefield by the staff, and Kayul, as the winner, went to the exit himself. He clenched his fist, as if remembering the past. He had long forgotten this feeling, the sense of victory, and what he feels now, when he has been rehabilitated as a magician, was amazing. A few minutes after the fight, Kim Kan-yoon and her companion were walking around the academy. He still couldn't believe that such a flash of super new magic had occurred. This greatly intrigued the man, who was serious about it. His gaze expressed his intention to learn more about Shin Hale, and he, having found himself at the academy, immediately met his friend Ji Suchin, who ran to congratulate him. He immediately hugged Hyle, said it was amazing, and immediately started asking what Hyle was doing behind his back. This magic was simply incredible, especially these wind spears and spell combos that were performed very quickly. Hyle asked if Suchin really wanted to know, but even his cheeks were burning with curiosity. Then Kayul approached his friend and began to whisper his secret in his ear. He said that there is magic there. It is a real secret while thinking about the book. Eventually, the match ended, and the media began to write about the new genius, Shin Ha-yul. Soon an interview was released that was conducted with Kayul after that legendary match. Journalists asked what this instant activation was that the student demonstrated. Everyone was wondering how he was able to learn to activate magic so quickly and change the trajectory and shape of the wind spear. But before the guy could answer, a man he didn't know appeared next to him and decided to answer this question for him. The appearance of someone from the Great Tower surprised Hyul very much, and he stared at the man. Kim Kan-yoon introduced himself and addressed Hyul, saying that he himself saw his last match. Coming closer to the guy, Cannon added that he thought Hyul had used the fourth circle memorization magic. The guy didn't even know what it was, but he realized that Kim Kang-yoon just wants to show off in front of the camera. Cannon used fourth circle magic to demonstrate to reporters how it was done. It was a spell that allowed one to activate a charm, the structure of which had to be known by heart, which was facilitated by memorization. Journalists asked why this magic was not used, but Cannon replied that it had a downside. It only allows you to use magic that is 3 magic circles below your current level. Hyul smiled back at Cannon, as he literally saved him, because Hyul thought for a long time about what words to use to hide Whitner's style. Theory. Kanina fit in perfectly, but the journalists were curious whether Hyul had really reached the fourth circle of magic. Nobody had any other options, so Kim Kang-yoon responded that this is definitely the case. The flashes from the cameras began to blind Cannon and the guy standing next to him. Soon, exclusive news emerged that Hyul took the fourth circle of magic at a very young age. This is a record comparable to the Lord of the Magic Tower himself, and since he himself paid so much attention to the guy, then it is so. Hyul's friend Suchin asked how he managed to get to the fourth circle, but he was even more interested in something else. This was also of interest to journalists. How would the guy explain the bypass of the source code? Cannon wanted to answer for Hyul again, but he stopped mid-sentence. Then the guy said he would explain it himself, adding that it was quite easy to bypass the rules of the spell source code. He simply managed to model his own formula and work with it. It was impossible to modify the magic formula, and Cannon understood this. In practice, this would be like trying to attach airplane wings to a car, just because someone wanted to fly it. This is definitely not something that can be done easily, especially by someone who is not compatible with artificial intelligence. I wonder what the future would be like with Shin Hyul if everyone learned to modify magic. But Kayul himself called his magic modification magic in front of journalists. As a special effect, the room was filled with a soft blue magical light. Kim Kang-yoon smiled in surprise, taken aback by such a statement. Now this is not just ordinary magic, but a real breakthrough that can be called a revolution. From this day on, the magical world will be turned upside down, and all the headlines will be about it. Ji Suchin looked suspiciously at his friend who had invented some strange, modified magic. He said that he doesn't believe in this nonsense, which even sounds strange. But in any case, Suchin was sincerely happy about his friend's victory. But it was time for him to return to the dorm. Suchin decided to prepare well for tomorrow's difficult opponent. Hearing this, Hyul even became interested in what kind of enemy this was. But everything could be found out personally the next day, which came very quickly. Everyone had gathered at the Obelisk Academy arena once again to watch the new fight, so the stands were filled with students just like last time. Suchin had not been able to defeat his opponent for a long time. Sitting on the ground, the guy tried to catch his breath while the girl hung over him. Hyul, watching the fight, understood that she was indeed a difficult opponent. Her name was Adela Steward, and she was very beautiful. The girl was from the French Steward family, being in the house of the Divine Guardians of Korea. All members of this house are legendary geniuses, born from the fusion of 2 famous magical families. Adela's magic in its manifestation was truly unique and powerful. The fact is that the House of Divine Guardians modified its magic, adding a lunar attribute to it. And now it was not just ordinary magic, but a kind of innovation in the fusion of forces. And when the girl wanted to strike again, Suchin had no choice but to put up a barrier. However, Adela was confident in her strength and directed it towards her opponent. Suchin's shield shattered into small pieces, and the guy himself was thrown to the side. Then the referee suddenly raised his hand and blew his whistle, signaling the end of the match. The girl, satisfied with herself, let down her long white hair in honor of her victory. Some supported her, some envied her, and only Kayul sat in thought. He thought about the combination of light and dark attributes that created the characteristic glow of the Divine Guardian's house. It was like moonlight and had its own range, power, and other characteristics that were not in the source code. It's no wonder that Adele is really hard to fight. But suddenly, Kayul noticed something that particularly caught his eye. When he looked at the girl, he found that she was looking straight at him. At first, Hyul didn't understand, thinking that he was mistaken, but her gaze was clearly directed at him. The guy didn't pay any attention to this and hurried to console his upset friend. Suchin was sad because out of all the possible opponents, he had to face Adela. Suchin then asked if Hyul had won his second fight, to which his friend responded in the affirmative. This meant that Hyul's next opponent was none other than Adela's steward. At this time, the girl approached Suchin and praised him, saying that it was a glorious fight. Suchin became embarrassed and thanked her in return. But Adele's gaze was directed only at Hyul. She seemed to be studying him, which made the guy feel awkward. Suddenly, she turned to Shin Hale and said that he had become a real wizard. Adela then added that there was one reason why she entered the academy, and she hoped that Hyul would help her remember it again. Although Hyul was from the House of Mages and Adela was from the House of Divine Guardians, they had both known each other for a long time. Their paths crossed even before they entered the academy, as both houses had close ties. Therefore, Hyul and Adela crossed paths at various events. But their relationship could only be described as rivalry. Adela even gave up her studies in France to join Obelisk and crush Hyul. As a child, he was always ahead of her, forcing her to work more and harder. However, since the boy proved unsuitable for interactive magic, Adela has not said a word about him. Hyul was branded a scumbag, and Adela lost the opponent she had been dying to defeat. Staring at the girl, Hyul said that he couldn't compete with her for now. She turned around and replied that they would test it in battle. Then Suchin turned to his friend and asked if everything would be okay. At first, Hyul didn't understand what his friend was talking about, but he was horrified. Doesn't Hyul realize that his next opponent is Adela's steward herself? Hyul himself seemed to have only just realized this and was in shock. He couldn't believe what Suchin said, but he had to. The next day, the rivals gathered again at the academy arena. Adela stood calmly, flexing her hands, waiting for her opponent. Shin Hyul still hadn't shown up, causing rumors to spread that he had decided to cowardly flee. And there was so much chatter about modified magic in the interview, but all Hyul could do was yap. He knows he doesn't stand a chance against Adela, that's why he's scared. Soon, the time ran out, and, according to the rules, Adele was awarded the victory. But then suddenly, Shin Hyul appeared at the door, shouting for the judge to stop. The guy, out of breath, smiled and apologized for being late. Then the judge, seeing Hyul, asked in surprise where he had been, but then he decided to find out later, but for now, he needed to start the fight without a break as punishment for being late. The judge's next command was for the students to take positions. Adela decided to ask why the guy was late after all. He exhaled and, smiling, replied that nothing special had happened. He was just making some minor preparations. Hearing this and seeing the guy's energy, Adela was surprised. Hyul said that the girl was quite strong, so he had to prepare thoroughly. The guy promised that the fight would be interesting, but Adela said that she didn't understand what could have changed in a day. But she herself felt that Shin Hyul, standing in front of her, was definitely not the same as yesterday. Adela hoped that the guy had a true gift that would give her some fun. Hyul, holding out his hand with mana, said that he would like to warn him about something. Adele better give it her all from the start. Then the match is on. Then Adela immediately created a huge ball of energy above herself, after which, with one movement of her hand, she sent it towards her opponent. It was the technology of the flame revolver, Adela's most powerful power. She increased the force of her blow threefold and then attacked. But Hyul, without flinching, also raised his hand up, calling forth the power of the wind. His magic was so strong that it blew the fireballs out of their trajectory. Adela seemed prepared for this and clenched her fist tighter, after which she used earth needles which looked more like sharp arrows. Under the force of such a needle, the ground under Adela's feet cracked and parted. The earth continued to open up a huge crack, heading straight towards Hyul. But he managed to jump back in time, doing a somersault in the air. Adela took advantage of this moment, as her attacks are harder to dodge in the air. She concentrated and stared straight at her opponent. She jumped up herself and decided to use an air attack. Hyul realized that this was an attack aimed at the enemy in the airstream. Even knowing about it, you can't avoid it, and most people think so, but not Hyul. He suddenly put up a barrier in front of himself, blocking the attack. The audience couldn't believe that Hyul had created a protective barrier right in the air. For Adela herself, this was simply unthinkable. Moreover, Hyul used the reversible barrier as a support. Then Adela realized that Hyul was still the same and had an incredible magical sense. The secret attribute of the Divine Guardian's house is the moon, and to counter it, Hyul must use everything he has. And to do this, it was necessary to use all the mana. That's why Hyul even decided to use the power of the sun in this battle. He knew perfectly well that for Adela, as the owner of the lunar power, sunlight was extremely unpleasant. At this point, Adele even had to cover her eyes with her hand from the bright light. The light of the sun was the most powerful weapon for her, which worked against her. Only then did the girl realize that Hyul was preparing an attack. In this case, she could only defend herself using the Great Cage. This was another attack towards Hyul, who again decided to defend himself with the power of air. Using the air element, he created a sword and grabbed it, after which he swung and hit straight at the barrier created by Adela. It was strong, but the guy's strength was also great, even though it was a first circle spell. And Adela's countermeasure spell was 3 circles, which meant that the girl was quite cautious. Hyul couldn't break through the shield, so he jumped to the side. The girl had no intention of stopping and continued her attack. She already wanted to rush towards Hyul, but suddenly realized that she couldn't go. Her legs became covered in ice and stuck to the floor, immobilizing her. This is what Hyul, who was in complete control of the situation, was waiting for. Adela realized that this was an earth binding, but I didn't understand how Hyul managed to activate it. Looks like the guy used it as soon as he landed on the ground. It was too fast even for Adela, who couldn't keep up with the guy's movements. Before she could even figure it out, he was already at her side. Sneaking up, Hyul immediately activated his energy. He used the magic charge technique to create a huge ball. But Adela wasn't going to stop and directed her power at her frozen legs, defrosting them. At this time, Hyul had already created 3 huge energy water balls. They, like dolphins at the behest of their trainer, headed towards their opponent. The girl immediately put up a protective barrier in front of herself. He was able to contain the energy of the water that gushed from the side of Hyul. Adela was already happy, thinking that it would be easier than she thought. She remembered Canon's words that Hyul most likely used the 4th circle memorization magic. Memorization allows you to use only enchantments 3 levels below the current one. And since Hyul is a 4th circle mage, only the 1st circle is available to him. And with only 1st circle spells, Hyulu definitely won't be able to defeat Adela. But suddenly behind the girl there was a sound like an explosion in the air, as if something had fallen from the sky. Adela didn't understand when Hyul managed to activate this new spell. It might be a modified version of the air spear. Hyul hit it in Adela's blind spot, who didn't notice it because of the sun. This blow was truly devastating for the girl. The sun prevented her from noticing the approaching attack in time. She fell to the ground as Hyul stood before her. The guy, looking proudly at Adela, said that, even though it was a long time ago, Adela should not forget who she is up against. Thus, Adela Stewart herself, devouring the guy with an evil look, was defeated. At the end of the test, Canon's assistant said that Hyul's fighting sense exceeded all expectations. Canon added that, from the delayed attack to the moment the guy dodged, he had planned it all from the very beginning. He dodged the attack in midair, forcing Adela to attack him. He then used the barrier as a support to gain altitude, while standing with his back to the sun, making it difficult for Adele to see. At this moment, Hyul instantly activated the long-term activation spell through memorization and created wind spears. Immediately upon descent, I used the air to distract Adela's attention. But at the same time, he created a ground anchor, pretending that he was simply landing. And while Adela turned away from the sun, her back was struck by a pre-calculated spear of wind. Canon noticed that Hyul is the most skilled magician of the 1st circle. The nickname he was given just a couple of days ago now has meaning. All this was heard by Shin In-hyuk, Hyul's father, who did not attach any importance to his son's achievements. Big deal. 1st circle magician, you have to look at it from all sides. Adela is also strong and can surpass Hyul in strength. Despite having the advantage, he cannot deliver the decisive blow. And this only means that he cannot finish the job. So there is nothing surprising about this, since the guy was just lucky. Moreover, Adela didn't even use her trump card. But her loss was a fact, and Hyul was happy with this victory. The girl, standing up, said that it really was not bad, as it reminded her of the past. But now she was going to fight in all seriousness. But this was just what Hyul was waiting for, and he immediately got into a fighting stance. Adela was filled with energy, and mana flowed through her body. Hyul immediately realized that the moon attribute was involved here, the special magic of the greatest house of divine guardians, called Halo. This powerful magic seemed to change the space around, filling it with the strongest energy. Even Hyul was shocked by this power, hiding his face from the light. A huge lunar pattern formed over the entire arena, exuding the greatest power. And already at that moment, Hyul's father truly relaxed, as if he knew the outcome. Then he calmly stood up and decided to leave so as not to look at Hyul. He thought the battle was over, there was nothing left to see. But suddenly something unexpected happened that attracted everyone's attention. The assistant was the first to break the silence, saying that this couldn't be. Kim Kanyun's eyes even lit up from what he saw. Friend Hyul, who was watching the battle, had his jaw dropped in surprise. Adela herself froze, not believing what was happening. Hyol was able to release energy from himself that was even more powerful than Adela's. He used the flame volcano technique, and the power of the fire covered the moonlight. Adela realized that this was real second circle magic. Hyol said he warned that he was late because he was preparing. Adela said in surprise that memorization only allows the guy to use the first circle. Could it be that Hyol somehow managed to reach the fifth circle? Looking confidently at the girl, Kayul remained silent, remembering what happened the night before this fight. The action took place in the Obelisk student dormitory late at night. Kyle sat silently, looking at his book and thinking about the fight. He knew that Adela was not an opponent that could be defeated in just the first lap. Even Hale's own fighting style is no match for her magic. Actually, the guy planned to fight Adela when he got stronger. But what opened up on the new page of the I Dread, although difficult, can be accomplished. It said that you need to pour mana into the magic formula, and this formula will also open up new facets of reality. Kayul became very curious about what exactly she was doing. But now is not the time to be afraid, so stop hesitating. The guy concentrated and directed his energy into the book. A bright and pleasant light immediately poured out of it. But then it became too bright. But this only indicated that the skill would be learned. Soon the light almost turned into an explosion, as if teleporting Hayol into another reality. It seemed as if that was what happened because a moment later the guy was no longer in the room. When he opened his eyes, adjusting to the dim light, Hayol was surprised. There were shelves of books all around him, a whole room of them. Looking around, Hayol tried to understand where he was. Then a voice was heard welcoming the boy to the first test page. It was the silhouette of a girl who called herself Alpha, the guide responsible for the first test page. Hayol decided to ask what exactly Alpha meant. The girl replied that this was the first test of what was hidden inside Adred. The fact that all this was happening inside a book shocked the guy. It turned out that this was not a teleportation somewhere far away, but a spatial dimension inside the book. It seemed simply incredible and impossibly cool. This makes it much more interesting to go through all the tests that the guy was eager to learn about. Alpha added that this test would test the intentions of Hyol's receiver. The girl promised to tell all the details during the test itself. If Hyol successfully completes the test, pages 18 through 31 will open, containing information on second circle magic. The boy realized that he needed to pass a test to receive instructions to advance to the next circle of magic. Then Alpha asked if Hyol wanted to begin the test. He confidently clenched his fist and said that he wanted to start already. Alpha bowed in gratitude and said she understood. Then she took off and said the test was beginning. Although it was too abrupt, Kayul was not frightened, but only became more and more surprised by what was happening. Alpha herself began to dissolve into space, changing it herself. Eventually, she disappeared, which surprised Hyol greatly. The Alpha seemed human, but it turned out to be a magical entity, which he definitely couldn't have guessed. Suddenly, a voice came from above and began to tell the details of the test. Kayul immediately recognized the already familiar voice of his teacher. The teacher sent Hyol a gem that was called Elemental. It contained an indefinite number of natural elements, chaotically mixed. Hyol's task is to set the final order of the mana in the stone, which seemed very difficult to the guy. Wild elemental stones are a delicate material, and their mana must be handled with extreme caution. There are only 4 types inside it, but mixing them creates chaos, so it will be difficult to organize the mana. Basically, it's like a mixture of grains of sand, salt, sugar, and pepper that somehow need to be separated. This is no joke, only a skilled master of the mind technique can cope with this. But this task, although frightening, intrigued Hyol very much, so he got to work. He used his mind technique to accomplish it. Millions of multicolored lights immediately flickered in the guy's head. They all merged into one heap, but soon separated into individual colors which turned into energy. She then floated smoothly around the guy, enveloping him. But that wasn't enough, so Hyol concentrated even more. In the end, the lines dividing the colors became very clear, and Hyol was finally able to collect all the colors separately. They all shimmered in one wild elemental crystal, but its energy threw the guy back. Hitting the bookshelves, Hyol realized that any fluctuation in mana would create a shockwave, so he had to act carefully. The guy tried to split the mana, but it was so mixed up that it was difficult to split. However, Hyol suddenly had a great idea and was ready to try, no matter how long it took. So, completely forgetting about time, the guy tried again and again to organize the flows. The slightest mental lapse forced me to start all over again every time. And then, finally, Hyol was able to do it by dividing the mana of the elemental stone. Here the teacher's voice was heard congratulating his successor on passing the test. Tired and out of breath, Kayul was glad that he was able to do it after all. Now that he has mastered the technique of the mind, the guy has one circle left, the circle of resonance. Hayul also became aware of Adred's new recordings, after which he opened his eyes as if waking up from a dream. At first, he couldn't even understand if it was all real, but his feelings couldn't let him down. He lay on his bed, realizing that he was back home. But there was little time, so the guy immediately decided to test his assumption. He took the book and opened its pages, which turned out to be filled. This made Hayul happy, as he finally formed a second magic circle. Now he realized that he needed to study all of this before the competition began. So the guy spent the whole night learning all these spells. And then, lost in time, he ran towards the arena where the competition awaited him. It all happened when Adela used the legendary power of the halo. She was confident that she would defeat her enemy with its help. But suddenly she noticed how the field of patterns she had created began to collapse. Like a hologram, her strength began to fade. But she did not stop pressing on her opponent. Sukin, watching this, became frightened, thinking that this was the limit for Hayul. After finishing her attack, Adela turned around, saying that this was the true end of the match. But to advance so much in such a short period of time was too much for Hayul. Adela has been wanting to know who Shin Hayul really is all this time, although it's too late to think about it now. The genius she was chasing was no more. Or so she thought, until she felt a surge of energy behind her. Adela immediately turned around to see what was happening. It was Hayul, who was still standing and using the power of the second circle. Activation resonance. The next step was the technique of darkness blindness, which connected two powerful energies together. Concentrating, the boy directed two connected circles of infinity at Adela. By connecting these circles, it was as if a new energy field was formed in space. It was all connected to the power of free will pulsating within Hayul. He commanded the energy to become his arms and legs, which shocked everyone. Not only Kan Yun, but also Shin In-hyuk stared at Hayul, not believing in such strength. Suchin and the other students were also shocked as they looked at their friend, who they had previously called a loser. It was like he was another person, and even Adela couldn't understand what was happening. It was as if four streams of energy burst out of the ground, which the guy grabbed with his hands created by his magic. Adela, looking at this power, didn't even know what to expect. Pointing his hand at the girl, Hayul used the fire volcano technique. She immediately jumped back and decided to use protective spells. But Hayul used resonance, the first version, which created a huge machine gun in the air. Seeing him, Adela froze in place and fear became clearly expressed in her eyes. She didn't even have time to scream, as she was unable to block it. Although her power was strong, her shield was cracking under the might of Hayul's power. Looking at the enormous energy, Adela smiled and acknowledged that the old Hayul had returned. Now he, who had pointed a machine gun at her, became her target again. Due to such a sharp surge of energy, the referee was unable to even whistle, dropping his whistle. After finishing his mad attack, Hayul stood in front of Adela's trembling body. Kanon and Inyuk couldn't take their eyes off the battlefield. The last thing they saw was Adela closing her eyes and staggering. She eventually fell to the ground right at Hayul's feet. And only after that the guy exhaled, sitting on his knees realizing that he had won. And so this fight was over, and Shin Hale was the winner. After this announcement, Father Hayul stood up again and, under Kanon's questioning gaze, headed towards the exit again. In response to Kan Yun's question, In-hyuk replied that he now had to fulfill his obligations. Kanon smiled suspiciously but kindly, saying that he understood everything. He then looked at the arena and stared at Hayul again. He smiled, but Kanon understood why, since his father was a man of his word. After the end of the duel, all the students returned to the academy impressed. Hayul, completely exhausted, walked down the corridor, thinking about resonance, the second circle of infinity. It synchronized with the first circle in his head, greatly strengthening his magic. The moon attribute magic that Adela used is a hybrid. He combined the range of light magic with the power of dark magic. In other words, if you pour dark magic into it, breaking the proportions, the range of destruction will decrease. With Hayul's more advanced dark magic, he was able to deal with the halo. After all, lunar magic, the secret technique of the House of Divine Guardians, is not something that can be easily learned. But just by briefly glancing at the magic formula back then, Hayul managed it thanks to his perfect mana control. The resonance circle allowed Hayul to understand the magic formula with incredible precision, deciphering the Sasu structure of the spell. Hayul gained such control over mana thanks to the disassembly of the elemental stone. And without it, defeating Adela would only be a dream for him. Suddenly, familiar footsteps were heard approaching Kayul. It was Kim Kang-yoon who was very interested in Haeul. The guy looked at the magician from the Great Tower in surprise, not understanding what they wanted from him. He couldn't believe that the Lord of the Tower himself was standing in front of him, but he calmly said that he really wanted to talk to Haeul. So Haeul and Cannon went together to a separate room and sat down at the negotiating table. Cannon smiled, apologizing for disturbing the tired boy, but he wanted to say that it was an incredible fight. Haeul looked calmly at his opponent and thanked him for the compliment. Then Cannon decided to get straight to the point, adjusting his glasses. He asked in all seriousness if the guy had really reached the fifth circle already. This question made Haeul fall into a stupor, but he did not answer. Come to think of it, Haeul used a second circle spell in battle, and the Lord of the Blue Magic Tower believes that he uses memorization, which meant that Haeul is at least a fifth circle magician. But the guy brushed it off, saying that he hadn't reached the fifth circle yet, perfectly understanding the reason for Cannon's questions. He immediately beamed happily and asked how the guy had used the second circle spell then. Then Haeul said, would Kanun believe him if he said he used a spell modification? Cannon thoughtfully assumed that this was the same modification that the guy mentioned on interview. Then everyone was surprised by Haeul's ability, but he clearly talked about changing the code. This is exactly what the guy meant, trying not to give himself away. No matter how you look at it, reaching the fifth round at 18 years old is simply impossible. It would be a worldwide sensation. Therefore, if you happen to use the third circle in front of everyone, it will raise a lot of questions. It's better to hide it for now, since Cannon, although he believed in the modification, didn't understand what relation it had to the magic of the second circle. Then Haeul replied that he had perfected the memorization itself. Hearing this, Cannon almost went crazy with delight. He laughed, stood up and exclaimed that it was possible after all. It was amazing for Cannon, who didn't know that Haeul had made it all up. The guy seemed to be under surveillance, trying not to give himself away. But Cannon only praised Haeul and said that the shortcomings of these charms are difficult to overcome. But the guy was able to. But suddenly, raising his head, Haeul noticed Cannon's bright red eyes. They seemed to scan the guy from head to toe like an X-ray. And Cannon's presence nearby caused Haeul more and more discomfort. He sat and did not know how to break this terrible gaze that seemed to have chained him. An awkward, even creepy atmosphere filled the room. But then Cannon smiled and said that everything was fine. There really is no magical mana formation characteristic of the fifth circle inside Haeul. It seems that Haeul wasn't lying after all when he said that he hadn't reached level 5. Smiling again, Cannon said it was time for him to go and explain everything to the reporters. Then he adjusted his glasses and once again glanced with his now usual yellow eyes at the frightened guy. But in the end, Cannon added that his red eyes that read magic would be proof. As a sign of respect, feeling fear, the boy bowed to Cannon, wishing him a good journey home. And he himself breathed a sigh of relief as soon as the door closed behind the man. Who would have known that the red eyes of the Tower Lord would be used to confirm Haeul's words? Almost everyone who knew about the Great Tower knew about these red eyes. Kim Kang-yoon was able to see the essence of mana itself with his own eyes, which are the best magic detectors in the world. But it turns out that Haeul passed this test and those detectors, since the Lord didn't say anything. Whitner's magical style is a top secret, and Haeul cannot reveal it to the world. Soon, the next match took place at the same arena for the guy. Naturally, the competition ended with Shin Haeul winning again. He was invincible to all the students who challenged him. When Haeul was already heading towards the exit, he was suddenly stopped by a female voice. Turning around, the guy was surprised to see the familiar Adela. Haeul thought that she would be unconscious for another 4 hours, but she still came, albeit with multiple wounds. The guy asked what she wanted, and Adela replied that if he didn't mind, she would like to discuss the past fight in detail. But it won't be now, since the final is still ahead, and if the guy is tired, then they could meet later. But Shin Haeul, smiling, replied that he was quite ready to do it now, since the analysis would not hurt him either. After telling the surprised girl to follow him to the waiting room, Haeul turned and left. There is a lot to learn from analyzing this match and all the strategies used in it. Although Adela felt awkward, she knew that she wanted to be like Haeul, and he felt her desire even from behind, but shyly remained silent. And while the guys were studying, Shin Haeul's skills were already being talked about in all the media. And this reached even those who certainly didn't expect it. In a huge room in a tall building, there was a girl who clearly didn't like the latest news. She looked at another interview with the guy and was angry, thinking that he was already finished. The girl was in the subsidiary office of the Magic Tower. She was the eldest daughter of a house of mages, standing in the room next to her older brother. The smile on the guy's face from the monitor puzzled her. She thought the battle was already decided, but Haeul stood firm. She turned to her brother and asked if the guy would really get away with this. Shin Sea's brother, Shin Jihan, calmly asked what his sister wanted him to do. But Shin Sia started screaming and asking what they would do if Hyul came back to the house. The girl could no longer bear this terrible atmosphere, but her brother hastened to assure her that everything was fine. Maybe a year ago, Hyul considered himself a genius, but now everything is different. He can barely handle the second circle of magic, so he is nothing in battle. Then Shin Jihan turned to his sister and asked if she had seen Hyul's matches. But Sia didn't calm down and whined about the hype around Hyul again. Here Jihan told his sister to listen to him carefully, putting his arm around her shoulder. Jihan said that the opponents in these duels were the most ordinary students who had barely reached the third circle. Even if Hyul faced a fourth circle newbie, he could easily cope, but he has a critical flaw. He is unsuitable for interactive magic. Let's say he found some way to compensate for it or used some ancient tricks, but his level is still inferior to the average fourth circle mage. Having calmed down, C agreed with her brother, saying that no matter how much Hyul tried, he could only flounder in the mud. Trash is trash. But this was only C's way of consoling herself, while still fearing that Hyul would somehow begin to threaten her position as the family's heir. Looking at his worried sister, Jihan turned towards her, and then he replied that in that case they would definitely easily deal with Hyul. By this time, it was already evening and the sky was covered with orange clouds. There was someone in the academy arena again, and the fighting continued. Two guys were wrestling with each other, practicing their blows. Here one of them fell to the ground, struck by a powerful attack. The referee immediately raised his hand and once again announced the end of the match. It was time to announce the winner of the midterm exam competition, and it was Shin Hel. The audience screamed in delight, supporting the returning genius. Someone, along with the name Kayul, glorified the House of Magicians, which is what the guy wanted. It was incredible to everyone that the guy had surpassed artificial intelligence with just ancient magic. Suddenly, Suchin ran out of the crowd, shouting that his friend was the best. He ran up to Hyul, grabbed him by the shoulders and started shaking him, saying that now everyone would recognize his skills. And while Hyul was trying to calm his friend down, a group of local bullies were watching them, saying that without these tricks, Hyul was nothing. But then Kayul's class teacher approached him and said with satisfaction that he was proud of his student. Then, Suchin asked the teacher, "How about a small party to celebrate the student's achievements?" Kayul asked his friend to stop, but the teacher said that he himself wanted to reward the boy for his success. Then a joyful Suchin shouted for all the kids to gather and go celebrate. But then Kayul awkwardly raised his hand and said that he would really like to go, but he had an important meeting. Suchin pulled away from his friend in surprise and asked what kind of meeting this was. How can you celebrate something without the hero of the occasion? But Hyul said goodbye and ran away, saying that it was very important. Suchin looked at his friend who was apologizing to him as he left with disappointment. But Hyul really did have a very important meeting right now to miss. He had almost reached the city center and began to look around. At the sidewalk, he saw an expensive black car and a man standing next to it waiting for him. It was the driver who called the guy young master and added that the head of the family was waiting for him. Bowing in respect, the man said he would escort Hyul to the mansion. When they got home, it was already early night. The moonlight illuminated the huge doors at the entrance to the mansion. Kayul was excited because he hadn't been here for a whole year. After being labeled as scum, he rebelled against his heartless father. After that, the guy entered the academy and stayed in the dormitory all this time. After all, he was forbidden to enter the family mansion, but now he is here. Looking around, Hyul noticed that nothing had changed. Everything remained the same, but the guy's feelings were alarming. He stopped in front of the door leading to his father's office. Hyul's relationship with his father had always been difficult, and In-hyuk's heavy gaze kept popping into the boy's head. But now he was finally back after a long absence and ready to meet. Father will no longer dare to tell him that he is insignificantly weak. Without thinking twice, Kayul clenched his fist and knocked on the door. Shin In-hyuk seemed to be waiting for just this, sitting in his rich and austere office, illuminated only by the light of the moon. When the man heard the knock, his red eyes opened. Then from behind the door, Kayul heard a familiar, "Come in," and he entered. Entering the office, Kayul bowed as a sign of respect, saying that they had not seen each other for a long time. He looked up and turned to his father with the same serious expression on his face. Shin In-hyuk, equally impenetrable, told the boy to sit down opposite him. As soon as Kayul sat down, his father began to talk about how he had already come to terms with his failure. But the speed of embodiment was so slow, and the formula dissipated as soon as the guy lost concentration. What can we say about the combination of charms that allowed Hyul to show himself only as a loser, an unsuitable candidate. But everyone recognizes Hyul's outstanding talent, so Inhyuk decided to redirect it into scientific direction. Of course, Inhyuk didn't expect anything this time either, but he thought that it was just a cry of despair from a worthless loser. Here, Kayul interrupted this speech and said that he understood everything. But the father continued, saying that when he saw the article, he thought it was a good opportunity. He thought that, faced with humiliation and another defeat, Hyul would come to his senses. But he completely shattered Inhyuk's expectations by managing to overcome the lack of incompatibility. Hyul was even able to create his own modification of magic. Now this round is only his, Shin Hyul. His prowess in battle is worthy of the title of a true wizard. Hearing these words from his father, Hyul's eyes showed shock. He stood up abruptly from his chair and loudly shouted his gratitude to his father for these words. But the father added that from now on, Kayul's family will fully support him. Let him ask for whatever he needs from his studies, and also let Inhyuk remove all restrictions related to the Shin mansion. As the rightful heir, Hyul must use his powers for the glory of their line. These words became the best motivation for Shin Hyul, who beamed with inner triumph. But the father reached forward and gave one last warning. If he rolls down again or stomps around in one place for a long time, then something terrible will happen. Shin Inhyuk will personally destroy his son's magic circle. Hyul understood that, as expected from his father, the pressure of the 8th Circle sorcerer was terrifying. But this was Hyul's last chance to prove himself, so he agreed to any conditions. Then Inhyuk sat down and asked what was Hyul's main goal. In the past, the guy seemed to want to lead the Shin family. Jihan, Saya, Minhyuk, and Minji are still far ahead of their brother Hyul. But he said that, as he said, he will not give up the position of head of the Shin family, and this is final. First, Hyul would force everyone here to accept him. But Inhyuk was curious about how the guy would do that. He stood up abruptly, leaning on the table, and said that this would happen in 2 months. The World Magic Olympiad will take place, where the most outstanding personalities from all over the world will gather and take part in it. And Kayul is confident that he will bring his father a gold medal from this event. This Olympiad is only available to students under 20 years of age and is held every year. It is a dream arena for those who want to attract the world's attention, and is renowned for its level of performance, which rivals that of adult wizards. But at the national level, they have the most outstanding result, a silver medal, which was once won by the Lord of the Blue Magic Tower. Then the father asked if Kyle even understood how impossible his promise of a gold medal was to fulfill. It's the World Olympics, so Kyle only replied that he had one request. For 2 months, until the competition is over, let the father not let the boy's brothers and sisters interfere with him. Inhyuk thought that Hyul was too desperate to use the gold medal, which was impossible for him, to get protection. Under any other circumstances, Inhyuk would have refused, but this situation was unique. It sounded too tempting, so the father agreed, and that was the end of their conversation. Already in the hostel, Hyul began studying his book again. He read so much information that he fell asleep right on the floor. The sun's rays had already penetrated the boy's room, waking him up. When he woke up, it took him a couple more seconds to come to his senses. The boy then remembered that as soon as he returned from the familiar mansion, he immediately began searching for the next test. Although he had only just completed the conditions for the second round, the guy was already impatient to move on to the third. This required a second test, but it was difficult to find, as there was not a single clue in the book. The only hope is to pump up the so-called resonance. It needs to be upgraded to the level of a master of the second magic circle. To reach the second test, he will pour mana into the book, causing it to shimmer, according to the principles of resonance. The guy did this with his heart's call circle, so the resonance course is somehow connected to it. There was nothing to understand from the records, so Hyul decided to just try using magic. Then 2 multicolored magical signs, intertwined with each other, appeared in front of the book. But in the end, nothing happened, and the guy's head began to hurt. Then Hyul decided to take a walk to clear his mind. It was broad daylight outside and the sky was clear blue. The sun was at its zenith, illuminating the city, which was bustling with life. Hyul walked down the street and thought that fresh air always helps clear thinking. After a walk and breakfast, you can try to delve deeper into the secrets of resonance. But then he heard a voice behind him warning of danger. But Hyul didn't have time to turn around before he felt a strange object approaching. Not having time to dodge the package flying at him, the guy fell to the ground. Finally, Hyul raised his head and asked how it happened that a plastic bag flew at him. However, he fell silent when he saw who was standing in front of him. It was Adela, who looked straight at Hyul with a worried look, asking if everything was okay. In the end, The guys decided to walk together, and the guy decided to ask again why Adela threw a bag at him. Adela awkwardly replied that she was simply giddy with happiness over her new purchase. She was really looking forward to drinking banana milk, and the bag just took and slipped out of her hands. It flew to the side and hit Hyle right in the head. But the guy replied that he understood everything, but Adele felt awkward and apologized. But Hyle replied that at least he got banana milk for free. The girl replied that she only drinks this because it is the best invention of mankind, and so her entire bag was filled with banana milk, which was strange even for Hale. So they walked together, chatting about nothing, and Adela remembered that she had heard that Hyle had gone home for the first time in a long time. The guy replied that everything was so, and he was finally given back all his rights as a family member. Adela was sincerely happy for the guy, asking if he still intended to become the head of the family. Kyle looked at her in surprise and asked if he had really said that before. The girl reminded Hyle that as a child she still drank banana milk and listened to the boy's dreams. So yes, Hyle has been talking about this since childhood, and more than once. But the guy suddenly thought about it and replied that now it was no longer his dream. Adela looked at Hyle in surprise and asked if he had really accepted the reality of this life. She added that the House of Magicians already has many worthy representatives, so it is not easy to become its head. But Hyle didn't understand why she was saying that because his dream was no longer just to get the House of Magicians. The boy was also determined to become the head of the Great Magic Tower and also conquer the top of the entire world of magic, becoming the most powerful hero. Adela didn't believe it at first, since conquering the world of magic was an unexpected and unattainable goal for her. For someone who has walked a path like Hyle, the goal will clearly not be easy. After chatting a little more, the guys went home, after which night fell. The moon illuminated the familiar mansion of the House of Magicians, where bewilderment reigned. Shinseiya bit her nails, overcome with anxiety about her brother's return. She turned to the calm Jihan, asking if he was really not worried at all. But the guy calmly replied that he was sure that their father had his reasons for everything. However, Jihan himself could not believe that In-hyuk had set such terrible conditions. This happened when the father himself called Jihan and Sia to come to his office, which was expected. In-hyuk said that, knowing them, he would have to give the boys a direct order. For the next few months, my father forbade anyone to touch Kayul. This definitely implied some kind of catch that neither of them liked. C immediately objected, shouting, "Why is this necessary?" But Jihan interrupted his sister, holding out his hand in front of her, and calmly asked why his father was saying this. In-hyuk replied that he was sure the guys knew that Hyle had been officially accepted back into the House of Magicians. His value is small, since he has not participated in the family business for a whole year. It might take him a couple of months to adapt again. Jihan and Sia may want to stop him by putting some pressure on him so that he does not encroach on the position of head of the family. The father understood that he was right, but still decided to ask if this was true. But Jihan smiled and answered his father that he understood everything, asking if there was anything else. In-hyuk replied that that was all, standing up from his chair and staring out the window, after which he advised the children to go and rest after a hard day. Adela, returning to the room, immediately asked her brother why he didn't even argue with his father. But suddenly, noticing her brother's face, she fell silent in fear, as it became distorted. Jihan replied with hysterical laughter that nothing would have changed anyway. Min-hyuk and Minji are not interested in competing for the position of head of the family. Jihan could understand why they weren't invited. But did his father really want them to leave Hyle alone just because he missed a year? Knowing his father, he probably told Kayul to somehow make up for lost time, since he was aiming for the place of heir. This protection is only provided to children under 16 who have not received their AI chips. Kayul is 17, so he doesn't fall into that category, so my sister wanted to assume that my father had already decided everything himself. But Jihan replied that this was out of the question, since Hyle had demonstrated too little. It looks like it's all because the father saw potential in the boy again. Maybe he's just interested in the unusual magic that Hyle developed. Or maybe he forced his father to make a deal with him, but then C didn't understand what the guy could promise? Clutching her head in panic, she screamed that her father would never have done something like that himself. Apparently, now she will also have to recall all the people she sent to spy on him, which Jihan agreed to. It was about the father's personal spies, working secretly for the family, who were good at everything from infiltration to espionage and protection. Jihan added that he had already called back all his observers before their shadows gutted them. Then Sia stood up and asked what Jihan intended to do then. Looking slyly at his sister, he replied that he would go first, as he understood that C rarely took part in anything herself. But Jihan didn't like the idea of being inactive for 2 months, and if Hyul had reached an agreement with his father, it could be dangerous. So Jihanu decided to use the help of the Black Magic Tower, while Hyul was unaware of anything while he was at the academy. The teacher praised his students because they all passed the midterm exam. But he was especially proud of the student who deserved applause and won first place, Shin Hyul. Calling the guy over, the teacher confidently said that he was the best student in the country among his peers. And since it is in first place, you need to try to maintain it for several months. This way, he would have a chance to participate in the World Olympiad, which is what Hyul was striving for. As the boy turned around and walked back to his seat, the students began to quietly talk among themselves. They thought Hyul was putting on a tough act for one trick and gave him 2 months. After this time, he will definitely disappear because he is still a loser. But Hyul didn't think so, but these conversations only played into his hands. Soon the class ended and Ji Suchin stood up from his chair, stretching well. 8 theoretical pairs seemed like an eternity to him. But Hyul remembered that from tomorrow on there would only be one practice. But Suchin replied that it would be no less stressful. But Hyul said that his friend would definitely benefit from some physical exercise. Hyul, seeing Suchin double over from the light blow, added that he was clearly out of shape. Suchin looked at his friend with an offended look and said that he would beat him in magic. But then he remembered how much success Hyul had achieved recently. But he said that if Suchin didn't like something, then he should work on his weaknesses. Suchin got angry and replied that he would definitely give Huyulu a punch in the pumpkin when he got pumped up. Hyul smiled and replied that they needed to grab some food and talk about it in the gym. Suchin stared at his friend in bewilderment, not understanding why he was smiling like that. Hyul rolled his eyes and asked why Suchin made such a face. Suchin replied that it wasn't that he didn't want to go to the gym, he just wasn't feeling very well today. Hyul frowned and told his friend to tell it like it is, and not to beat around the bush. Then Suchan approached his friend and said that he didn't hate training, but he didn't like training with Hyul. Hyul asked in surprise what he was doing to Suchin, but he replied that the guy was simply scaring him. But this answer did not surprise Hyul, since in fact everyone thinks so. For strength training, the guy went to the academy's gym, where he always lifted heavy weights. He did squats with huge weights, surprising everyone around him, as no one believed that a person was capable of lifting such a weight. Everyone was whispering about the strength of Shin Hyul, the second-year champion. The guy continued training, not paying attention to anyone. After finishing the approach, Hyul thought that he had been so focused on studying Whitner's magic that he had completely neglected physical exercise. But in 8 or 2, a lot was said about this, so we must not forget about it. Since the circle of infinity circulates throughout the body, physical training can improve it. In a healthy body, there is a healthy circle since they interact, so you need to train both magic and physics. And then Hyul will have both the strength and the body of his dreams, but he needs to put in the effort. It's time to practice in the academic simulator. Now the aggressive eyes of an evil panther looked at Hyul. There were 3 of them, and they were all circling around the guy, wanting to attack. There was no need to wait or ask for long, as the predators, having teamed up, pounced on Hyul. Their claws were sharp and their speed was worthy of the fierce cats. But the guy managed to activate magic and jump to the side. The streams of magical energy were completely controlled by the boy's fingers. They began to wriggle like whips and headed towards the panthers. 2 of them attacked at the same time, but Hyul managed to dodge, projecting a collision between the panthers. After landing, the guy gathered fire energy in his hand, using the flame volcano technique. The ball hit its target, destroying the panthers who were unable to dodge. One of them was still operational, but the ball returned to it like a boomerang. Thus, Shin Hyul's training with the monsters was completed. The teacher stood nearby and counted the boy's results. To his further surprise, the guy got a perfect score, which was just great. After training, the guy sat down to rest, thinking about the circles of infinity. Thanks to them, Hyul's physical capabilities increased by at least 1.5 times. When he reaches the 3rd circle, the power will become even greater. The guy wanted to enhance the infinity circles as much as possible. He decided to concentrate by creating a resonance circle and activating 2 streams of mana at once, spreading throughout his entire body. Now, it was necessary to reduce vibration and flow deviation by 12.25% and 4.3% respectively. Then level the flow of the heart's call by 8.9%. There was still a little left to reach the goal. Eventually, Hyul finished, breathing heavily, having managed to synchronize the flows by 99%. That last 1% just wasn't given to the guy, no matter how hard he tried. But he considered it his duty to bring the second round to perfection. He was confident that he could handle it, but now he decided to go for an evening jog. The night air blew into the face of Kayul, who was running along the road, wearing headphones and not concentrating on what was happening around him. But suddenly something flashed around the corner right next to him. Turning around, he noticed a shadow in a robe as if watching him. And then suddenly a fist flew out from around the corner towards Kayul. The guy managed to dodge the blow, wanting to find out who decided to attack him. Kyle stood up and angrily asked who the guy was who attacked him. Taking a closer look, Hyul was surprised when he realized who it was. Beck Sahek's evil eyes peered out from behind the hood of his robe.